Welcome to the Square Developer Podcast. I'm your host, Richard, Head of Developer Relations here at Square. And today I'm joined by Peter from Ngrok. Peter, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'd love for you to just give us like a little bit about yourself, a little bit about Ngrok, and let's kick things off.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me. So my name is Peter Shafton. I'm the CTO of Ngrok. I've been with the company for a little over 3 years, and I actually learned about Ngrok way back from when I was at Twilio about 13 years ago, because the founder of Ngrok, Shreve, was an engineer on a team there that I was running at Twilio. Mm-hmm. So when I first started the voice and messaging parts of Twilio, that was actually the beginnings of Ngrok. But I've been sort of bouncing around Silicon Valley for a lot longer than that. A bunch of companies you all have heard of probably, like Cisco and Yahoo, and those who are old enough, SGI, and then a bunch of little startups that people maybe didn't hear of as much. But yeah, that is my past. So I'm a developer at heart, an engineer at heart, and then somehow ended up doing architecture and running technology.
I feel like they always trick us and lure us into this in some way. I mean, it's very alluring, but then eventually you're just like, wait, what happened? I'm now the CTO of a company.
That's right. As long as they don't take away the keyboard and I can still type code there, then I'm happy.
Do you still get to occasionally write some code for things, or when do you find the time for it?
I do it badly. And most of my engineers hopefully don't let me do that. I end up in the data space more than anything, where I'm spelunking through SQL or the data warehouse and data lake areas. But at times I'll write some low level code and networking code and things like that.
I mean, you got to find the time for it. It's kind of invigorating, but at the same time, I would agree that, outside of like DevRel, I'm less inclined to build stuff that's going to be relied on in production, and I'm more inclined on building here's how to do this particular thing, or here's a little script for pulling some data together so that we can make sense of stuff.
Yeah, I think most of us got into this because we loved writing code. I think if you'd asked me, I was a young kid at an Apple II Plus, and I didn't realize this was a career. I just thought it was a really cool hobby to have, and then the thought that somebody would pay me to do it. And so this is the piece that got us excited, right? If you left most of us alone, we would still be writing code. It's just nicer when you're doing it at scale and allowing other people to see what you built versus
I think it's really well put, because most of the time I'd build tiny little automations in my house for now it's much easier that when I want to go to bed, it turns all my lights off at one time instead of just me having to go through all of them. But now it's now I can solve problems for thousands of people, millions of people.
Oh yeah.
So you used Ngrok a long time ago before you actually even joined the company. I'm curious, what was it when you first used it? Two things I'd kind of want to answer. For anyone who's maybe not familiar, we can give a quick little explanation of what Ngrok is, and then what was it like when you first used Ngrok that made you fall in love with it? Or I don't know if you'd call it love, but I felt like I fell in love with it when I first used it.
It's a good story. Yeah. So there was an engineer by the name of Jeff Program. He was one of the early engineers at Twilio at the time. He had come from NASA, and he built a tool called Local Tunnel, and he built it for a very specific purpose. So Ngrok basically fit into the webhook infrastructure that was Twilio. So the early days of Twilio, and it's still true today, is all powered by webhooks, which effectively means you get an inbound phone call, you get inbound text messages, you want to respond to that and control the programmability. You had to respond with XML, with TWIML at the time, to an inbound web request, because that looked very much like how the internet worked. They figured people were writing PHP scripts or Python code for a website. They were used to getting a form post and responding. They thought, you can just reuse that infrastructure. It just happens it's a telephone that's calling you instead of a browser client making the request, which made a lot of sense because that was what the developers were doing and it was easy to build on. The challenge was if you're inside Twilio and you're building the product and you need to be able to test it or even iterate on what you're doing, a very slow loop is I build the thing, I deploy it to production, I let a webhook hit it and see if it works or not, right? What we wanted to be able to do was change the code, maybe even sit in a debugger and have the webhook come in and trigger our code. And so to solve that problem, Jeff built something called Local Tunnel, and it was a simple bit of Ruby code that effectively gave you a dynamic URL. So if you think about it, they call it reverse proxy, but you basically have a little sidecar sitting on your machine. It makes a network connection out to a server that is on the public internet. and it tells that server a domain name to use. So foobar or whatever it is, if you hit that request, it'll basically tunnel the traffic back to your local machine. So you can iterate and have something that kind of looks like it's on the internet. It's accessible on the internet, but it is not otherwise there. It's on your local machine, and if you shut it off. So that was local tunnel, and it was used inside Twilio. Alan was one of the engineers at Twilio using this, and it was fine when there was just a few of us. As it scaled up, we realized the Ruby implementation was not particularly scalable.
Yeah.
Didn't really serve our purpose at scale. And so he said, I think I can rewrite this, and I think I could do it much better. And he started to iterate on it in Go. And when he left Twilio, he said, I'm just going to make this a side project. And it was. But it turned out it was a side project that went very, very far. So the early implementation of Ngrok was very much a tool for testing webhooks, for developing websites, for developing APIs. And that was kind of the early history of the product and of the company.
And like that's exactly where I probably first started interacting with it, when like it became this sort of like tool that was like put out there. And I remember like even really early on, it was just like, it was very, I mean, it was straightforward for like signing up, like if you actually wanted to use it beyond like the sort of like free version of it. But I gotta say, like, that after just installing that CLI tool, putting it in like, your local bin folder, and then just, calling it from your path wherever you want. And I think the first time that like really got me was when I was working on something at a company, and I was like trying to update stuff on like a marketing page, and like trying to get whatever it is that they wanted the way that they wanted it. And I just ran Ngrok and like had a URL, and then I was able to like send it to them and say like, hey, is this what you're wanting it to look like? And like they were just immediately giving me feedback and like testing things, and I could see all the traffic of like what they're doing in there. And that was like a really amazing thing, because normally I would have had to like take all of that, push it somewhere, put it up on like a staging version, some like deploy it somewhere. And I really was not at that point. I was like, I'm just trying to move things from one place to another, and I want to show you what it looks like on my machine. The ease of using it was just so great.
Yeah, no, it made a lot of sense, I think, in the early, it still does for different reasons, but the early days, the sort of the aha moment, we have a tagline now we use that says online in one line, which basically meant like you could download the Ngrok executable, type in a simple command line like you might for curl or something, and you'd be up and running, right? And I think the fun part was both testing for folks like you and I, or iterating on code. Turned out, and Richard and I were talking a little bit before this about like having automated home infrastructure. And those of you who have put up stuff in your house and automated it and realized, well, if I want this to be accessible when I'm not at home, then I need to somehow punch a hole into my home network, right? And that often meant messing with the settings on an Xfinity router or an AT&T or something else to figure out how do I open this thing up and allow access. And Ngrok made that really simple too. And so we found a lot of developers that were hobbyists and that were doing and automating things, and that sort of device gateway or access became the early days of how it was used. I think, the scary part is once you put something on the internet, like, okay, this is out there, then you forget that it's on the internet. Everybody can hit it and use it. And so having other sets of capabilities that do allow you to put authentication in front of it, other things became the obvious kind of next steps. And if you look at the history of the company, you can see where that progress happened. But it was always that sort of aha moment that I think got early developers. And it's crazy sort of the scale of this hit. There are over 10 million developers that are using Ngrok, and thousands every day that come down, which, you think of something that was bootstrapped, was hard to imagine that you would start that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, like the growth and like the evolution of the product has really impressed me over the last few years, because initially just seemed like, it seems like such a simple, straightforward tool. And like, when you're a developer just trying to like say like, oh, I'm just trying to like build and test my webhooks, and I have to expose those to the platform that's going to call them if I want to do any kind of like local testing. And then you kind of just go, okay, like that's it. But then I think that there's other people who just went like, well, what else can I use this for? And like, you really start like, tell us a little bit more about like how those use cases started to like really evolve, because I think it's like very interesting to sort of understand like, I'm punching a hole, I can do webhooks testing, or I can do like, let somebody see my local development. But this ability to like communicate within the same network in like a secure way is pretty common for a lot of like really like large apps.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are really interesting, and it paralleled a lot of the story of the time I had at Twilio as well, which was like if you build a platform, it was sort of built of these basic primitives, but it was programmatically driven. Like you had an API to manipulate it or set it up, and you could scale it from anywhere. It enabled all these use cases you're alluding to, and so that is sort of the fun of what Ngrok has become and continues to become. Like in the simplest sense, you're testing, but if you think about it, at some point you have to handle webhooks in production, right? Like often you're connected to Square, right? You're going to handle webhooks from that API. They have to go into your infrastructure. You want to manage them and like why stand up another infrastructure to do that? The benefit of being able to shut things down or keep them up or scale them. A lot of the things that we've built and continue to build echo the problems I had at Twilio. If you think about when you first put an API on the internet, you're like, well, my first problem is just making it accessible. Right? You're like, great, I've got it up there. People can hit it. This is wonderful. And then there's sort of that uh-oh moment where you say, well, wait a second, a lot of people are hitting it and I have to probably rate limit them, right? Like I don't have capacity to handle all these people and I don't want to like throttle my request to one customer because another customer doesn't have enough bandwidth. And so I need rate limiting. And I have to rate limit by customer ID. And maybe I have some customers that pay me more and I want to give them more capacity. And at Twilio, I had to build an API gateway team, right? I had to build a team that could do that. And then the other problems you start to have is, well, gosh, I have customers that aren't just in my city. They're actually hitting me from all over the world. And the latency some of them are getting is quite bad because they're coming in from Asia or from Europe or from somewhere else that don't have infrastructure there. And so at Ngrok, we literally had to build out the distributed infrastructure to support that so that you could go from just running it locally to running it remotely. But I think, the fun part about having a platform like that is, and I think you alluded to this, is people just auto-discover it, right? I'll give you an example of a story. There was, and I won't tell the name of the company just to make it more fun. There was an IT guy who works at a company that sold a food product and expected to receive mobile ordering, but they didn't have a mobile ordering infrastructure yet. What they had was a bunch of brick and mortar stores. People would come into and order things like coffee. And he was tasked with like trying to figure out a way to make this work. And he grabbed the Ngrok executable and stuck it on his point of sale system that was running Windows. And lo and behold, not only did that give him an API web endpoint that he could hit, but it gave him access to his database. And he could look at like the end of day sales for the store location by pulling down the database at night. And he could push updates for discounts and products in the morning. And lo and behold, he could drive all them over. And he sent an email to Alan. He said, I just did this thing. I downloaded Ngrok. I can do this, right? And Alan said, sure. Like it wasn't what I thought about when I first built it, but it works for that. And lo and behold, like that store grew to 28,000 locations. And that company does millions of dollars a day of mobile ordering across Ngrok because those store locations, if you think about it, have home networks like you and I do, right? These are not like, they often use, some cases, a cellular connection. In some cases, they were using like AT&T or Comcast or whomever. And so he needed to be able to have a reliable network connectivity. Then he didn't want to go and update the routers on each of those locations or convince the IT team. So it was sort of a fun and interesting use case. I've seen people control smart mirrors, remote control boats and planes that they remote into and give access. And these things just have cell cards in them, right? They're going over the cellular network. So it's sort of fun to see both the things people have done that are like hobby and interesting and unique, but also the places where people have used this and built entire businesses on top of it. Because connectivity was key for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, I think it's like when thinking about like the layers of an app, and like, I think it's like often like that the network layer is one that I mean, I know like when you're dealing with like really large scale apps, like you inevitably always think about the network layer. But I think like when we're first like building out like a web application, we kind of just like take the network layer for granted. It's just like, yeah, like it's going to be exposed in some way. And then, we have an auth model, but like there's so much more that you can do there that like, I mean, I'm just imagining like with Ngrok that it's so much more possible to say like, yeah, we have like a private network that most of our application infrastructure is communicating on. And occasionally it would be great if like for something that's like, say, existing in a more hostile environment, like say a storefront with their own networks that are connecting to devices, we can only trust so much. And it's like, but you have this one machine the point of sale, where you're like, I want to be able to punch a hole for just this specific device, and it
right.
can talk to my private network through this particular endpoint that I've created here for it to communicate. And like that is like actually like, I mean, not a lot of people have to deal with this, but I feel like it's one of those things. It's like, it suddenly goes, oh, this makes this so much easier than having to think about like, mobile device management and certificates and certificate pinning and all these other security mechanisms that you have to employ when you're dealing with like all of these different devices.
You're exactly right. And it's interesting because we really saw what we have seen is about 4 or 5 use cases that are traditional. The device gateway, that sort of connectivity to remote devices, is an interesting one. An API gateway has been another interesting one. I'll give you an example. When I was at Twilio, we acquired 2 companies that a lot of people had heard of. One was called SendGrid, that sent email, and another was Segment, that did data processing, right? And imagine you acquire companies that are fairly significant. They each have significant data infrastructures, right? Like they already had a footprint in GCP or AWS, or in SendGrid's case, on-prem, like a private data centers in Colorado. And when each of those companies set up their infrastructure, they created private IP ranges. And when Twilio acquires them, gosh, we should have a single API, right? Like you should be able to send email to SendGrid via the Twilio API. And you think about that, well, that's hitting the Twilio endpoint. And you might say, well, okay, all we'll have to do is things that are /Twilio, /email should go here. Like, well, how do I do that, right? Like they have their own ingress points. They have their own, and they're in a different environment. I can't just take the DNS that goes to one place and send it somewhere else. I can't split it in the middle and say things that are -v1 should go here. Like all of the complexity of the network and the great intelligence we had ahead, we had totally overlapping private IP space. So I couldn't just route from one infrastructure to the other because the IPs were redundant, right? That it was not clear where I was going with the traffic. And so Ngrok, if we had had it at that time, would have enabled me to basically say, hey, listen, I want to shard this anywhere I want, right? The network is effectively as programmable and configurable as the other parts of my software stack are. And I could have said, hey, my V2 version of my API, which will be somewhere in this path, is going to route to my new infrastructure that, guess what, I've stood up in the Azure cloud, or like things that match these headers or these parameters, I want to send this other way. And so being able to do that through a programmable network interface was really what is powerful and interesting about Ngrok. And there is an infrastructure today that we've built that basically uses traffic policy. And the idea is that all of the information that's available to you on an inbound request can be used in rate limiting, in routing decisions, in decisions as whether to force somebody through authentication flows. And that allows customers of ours to solve problems we hadn't even considered today. So we see customers who are doing exactly that, sending some traffic to different infrastructures to challenge certain users with authentication, or add special headers or modify their payloads, either inbound or outbound, based upon what they see. And one of the fun things we worked on was to scrape the web for public data sets about IP addresses, right? So you have geodata. Everybody's kind of familiar with MaxMine and other places. You can say, well, listen, given an IP, I can figure out the country. But it turns out people publish the IP addresses of Tor exit nodes. They publish the IP addresses of block lists, or the ranges of IPs that belong to Square or Amazon or Microsoft for their services. And you can annotate those IPs as they come in, and you could say, hey, listen, not only am I going to validate the Square authentication token and signature of their webhooks to know it came from Square, I can also tell, hey, it came out of a Square IP address. And so it's really hard to spoof this. And all of that information, not only do we use ourselves to protect our platform, but is available to our customers to use in really interesting ways. And so that's been really fun to see. Some people are used to blocking countries, but you can imagine doing things like when a request comes in, I can look up based off the authentication which customer that is. Are they a VIP customer? Should I send them into another infrastructure? Should I provide to them a different rate limiting rate? And that's what's been sort of fun to see. Like for us, it's a platform. For everybody else, it's a playground.
Yeah, no, totally. And like, I mean, I feel like one thing that is interesting about what you've sort of touched on in there, that like, so when I first joined Square, 7 years ago, one of the first things I did was like, I was immediately starting to build something that's going to be like making use of our webhooks. And like, as my knee jerk reaction was to like use Ngrok to like expose an endpoint and then register that and then like start seeing my feed of events happening in the system. And one of the things that I think most people like might not understand at first, because like, when you first say, hey, we're going to like punch a hole in the network and it's going to be publicly available, you're exposing something onto the internet. I think that like the reality is like, it's more secure than you might think it is. And I'd love to sort of touch on like, the ways in which Ngrok is sort of, I don't know if I'm stretching and saying like secure by default, but I think like, what ways is it sort of secure by default? So like when people use it, they're not like necessarily worried like, oh my gosh, somebody's going to like be able to call into this and start seeing stuff on my system.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different levers you have, right? Like, so you think about it, and it's interesting because it kind of depends on people's use. In the old days, or the first early days, you could have an HTTP or TCP endpoint, which kind of meant you could basically have an IP, a domain name, and a port that was open to everybody. And while that's very powerful if you're fronting a thing you just want to get online, we already know about HTTPS and TLS and SSL as mechanisms to know at least you're talking to the thing you think you're talking to, right? And part of that is, is there a certificate for it? Is that certificate up to date and valid? And if you've been running network infrastructures, sometimes your certificates expire and you have to renew them. Ngrok takes over all of that part of the management, right? The second thing you can think about is the traffic transiting the Ngrok network secure in another way? So I've secured it through TLS, but where is TLS terminated, right? Do we terminate it at our edge? Does it need to be terminated all the way back at the service that's actually handling it? At an Ngrok, you can choose where you want. So we have customers that do zero trust, that basically we don't see their certificates. We do not terminate the traffic. We route it through and it's up to them to terminate. But in the world where, and there's a bunch of protections you can do with that. One example is you might know the IP addresses these requests are coming through, and you can whitelist those and say, hey, listen, these are only IPs I'm going to allow, or there's a set I want to deny. And with the IP intelligence, you can effectively say only from this ASN or other pieces that make it even more flexible. There's DDoS protection. If you think about it, it's like, okay, I put this thing up. Am I going to get hit with a packet flood? And so we have a firewall layer that does detection of SYN packets, and it does it globally. So it has to basically know, okay, maybe it's an attack that's actually being spread wide enough across the world that any single node doesn't kind of see it. But in aggregate, I do. And so that is a piece that we have both to protect ourselves and to protect our customers. The other use case, we talked a little bit about authentication. You can turn on authentication and say, as an example, hey, I want to use Google Auth, and they have to match this domain. As an example, we use Google Auth for Gmail and other pieces. And so if you don't come in with an ngrok.com domain and authenticate through Google, I don't let you in. But you can imagine you can also use a subset of emails within that domain. Maybe it's just mine. Maybe it's just me and you, Richard. And so that's another way. And then when you're doing machine-to-machine communication, obviously the machines are not going to authenticate through that, but they can do mutual TLS. In that case, like they have a certificate that they have to mint on the client side and validate that that's what's coming in. And so all those are the building blocks that kind of allow you to secure the edges that you have. And then the last piece of it kind of becomes observability. And so if you've used Ngrok in the early days, you kind of remembered you could hit port 4040 on a local port, and you'd have this browser window. And the browser window showed you, hey, this is the traffic. Not only could you see it, but you could actually kind of replay it. So as you alluded to, somebody was testing a webhook. You're like, great, my code is broken. Can I just replay that? And you could. We've moved effectively all of that logic server side. So now, like if there's a team of developers, you can see all of the traffic that is coming through. You have the IP intelligence on that data too. And you can kill sessions and block sessions. So if you're doing authentication through us, you can say, no, I'm going to take Richard's token away. And any traffic that he had will cease to be functioning right now. And I can see the history of what he had done. And all of that was pieces that we thought were really interesting. And then conceptually, you can replay through that same interface. And all of these were built effectively to solve the problems Alan and I and others were seeing in our history of the last 30 years. But the stuff that developers are coming to us and telling us like, hey, I'm seeing this. I need you to be able to do this. I need you to be able to scale this way. And it's been, that's really the power of the platform.
No, I mean, like it's really impressive because I mean, like, there was several years ago when we had acquired Weebly, and as part of trying to get them integrated into like the rest of our infrastructure, is like one of the primary ways that they would communicate was like through our own APIs. So as you can imagine, like one of the things that most of the engineers working on that integration process was having to like integrate with our webhooks. And, like the go-to thing was like, yeah, like you spin up Ngrok. And then once we were able to actually like get it working within our networks, it was like a more secure way for them to be able to just like spin up, start seeing feeds and building into our systems to sync databases between, Weebly and Square Online. But yeah, so when Weebly was like onboarded, I mean, like one of the things that we pushed really hard for was like having better tools for doing these integration processes, and it's really great to like finally be able to like use this more predominantly, and also like recommend it to people coming onto our platform like externally. So like third party developers who are like, hey, I really want to build an app on the Square developer platform. Our top recommendation is usually to just use something like Ngrok to like be like, oh, if you run this, you can like start building against our webhooks. I know previously, we've all probably used, what was the name of that site? I want to say it was like website.webhooks or webhooks.website or some it was like
webhooks.fyi.
Yes, where you just like, you can like drop it in and you can like see events come through. But the problem that I've always had with that is like, yes, I can see the events coming in, but like it's not running against my code. Like my code is not reacting to any of the webhook events. And so I'm not seeing like the additional parts of this of like actually seeing like, is my code that relies on the webhook events working appropriately? With that, I also wanted to just plug one other thing that I'm excited to try out. I will be forthright in that I have not tried it out, but the SDKs that you have for actually using Ngrok in application code, which I will admit, it kind of like hurts my brain a little bit to think like, okay, so like the code itself is not going to be like aware that like it's actually really sort of tunneling out traffic and like responding to stuff through here. But tell us a little bit more about like these wrappers that you have to kind of enable that kind of integration directly within somebody's code.
Yeah, there's two fun pieces here. So the first, as you allude to, most people who are familiar with Ngrok or have used it in the last decade are used to downloading an executable. You're like, hey, did you download Ngrok, right? And that's sort of this traditional thing. It's a separate executable that you start up. For those of us developers, that might not be a big deal. If it turns out you're building with Ngrok and you want it to be part of the infrastructure you're standing up, sometimes you don't want your customer, like maybe as you allude to, you're building a Square app. You don't want to tell your customers, hey, go download Ngrok to use this. And so we built SDKs in a bunch of different languages, Rust and Java and JavaScript and Go and Python, that you can just build the capability. And what Richard is alluding to is we did it in a way that effectively, in most of your code, you're used to standing up like an HTTP server or something like that. And those servers are often based on basically a TCP socket, a listening socket, effectively they open. Ngrok, for all intents and purposes, looks like a listening socket. So effectively, these libraries provide a socket that just can be handed to the HTTP server objects in Java and Python and Flask RESTful and all these things that the frameworks you're used to playing with. And so your code isn't aware and conceptually could choose on the fly to be Ngrok enabled or not. And the interesting part about that is often when you're running locally, you have Ngrok there because otherwise you're not accessible. You can't get requests from the outside world. And when you push to production, the incentive is like, well, now I'm going to re-architect the thing. I'm going to put Nginx or some other form of ingress in front of it and talk to the IT team to get it all set up. The answer is if you built it this way, you don't have to do that. Mm-hmm. Effectively, you can just push the executable up and it is actually internet enabled at that moment, right? Because it is an outbound socket that's powering it. And so that's really cool for the SDKs and the use cases that people ship it. There is another part of that story that I think is really fun and interesting. Is a piece you'll see called the Ngrok Kubernetes operator. So in this world, you basically have a Helm component that you install, and there effectively is a service within your Kubernetes cluster that acts as the ingress to that pod. And so when people are used to using Kubernetes and using the gateway API or setting up an ingress or load balancer, they basically leverage Ngrok to be that load balancer. So now you don't have to worry about, is my Kubernetes infrastructure running in AWS and I should use ALBs and NLBs? Is it running in Azure or GCP? Is it running on my local machine? So you can basically have ingress to services and the same definition of endpoints. The other fun part about that mechanism is you can effectively tunnel traffic from your local machine into a Kubernetes cluster. So imagine you have a Kubernetes cluster running in production or in staging. and it has a bunch of services running, but one of them you want to iterate on. That workflow normally would look like I work on my code, I write the Docker file, I deploy it to that cluster, and then I test it and realize I broke it again. In this world, effectively, that service endpoint that's in that cluster just tunnels the traffic through to your local machine. So it's sort of how you were using Ngrok today to say, my service will be visible on the public internet. Now you can say my service would be visible in a Kubernetes cluster. And that allows you to do things what we call private or internal endpoints. So if you think about, hey, Ngrok, I put this thing up, it's on the public internet. You can actually say, hey, Ngrok, I put this thing up, but it's actually not publicly accessible. It's only accessible from within this Kubernetes cluster, and other services and pods within the cluster can hit it. But people from the internet cannot. And if I want to expose my local machine, then we manage the mutual TLS certificates that guarantee that the traffic coming in to hit your machine is actually coming from that cluster. And so those pieces are really interesting building blocks as well, because we see a lot of people who their deployment model actually is Kubernetes, right? They're actually deploying pods, they're actually workflow. And this works much more elegantly for that use case. And so that's a piece that's been fun as well. And it works in a similar fashion to how you think those SDKs work. And guess what? It's actually using our Go SDK.
Yeah.
Right. So it is both a consumer and Ngrok. The fun part is we dog food everything. So our API, our website, our docs pages are all fronted by Ngrok. So they are rate limited and protected and globally redundant by our own platform. It's a little meta, right? If you think about it, Ngrok's behind Ngrok.
Yeah.
But it is.
But I mean, like, you know, like I find it hard to like find a better way to like really like iterate, because like on a product, because like you're customer zero, like constantly. And so like if it works, it's working for you. It hopefully is working for everyone else. And like you can continue to improve and expand, but like you're still serving customer zero. So you're not breaking yourself. Otherwise,
you're right.
you know, you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, we had a funny story. We put the website, we had a lot of the components behind Ngrok already, the API and the dashboard. We hadn't yet put the website, ngrok.com. And when we did that, 4 hours later, we got hit by a DDoS attack. And we were like, okay, like this unexpected. At first, we thought we had done something wrong in the deployment. Turned out, no, we were getting hit. When we looked in our observability, realized the traffic was coming a lot from block lists, a lot from Russia and China. And so we said, well, okay. We flipped on a bunch of the traffic policy protections to block Tor exit nodes, to block things on Firehole or other block lists, and Russia and China explicitly. 4 hours later, we got hit by another DDoS attack. And lo and behold, at that point, it had no effect on our infrastructure. So it was sort of fun to see how quickly we got insight. And it was, I would say it was about 7,000 times the amount of normal traffic we see on the website. So it was clear, as much as I know Ngrok is popular and I love to see spikes of traffic, that was not something that we expected.
Yeah.
But it was a funny use case. Yeah.
Yeah.
Normally that would have taken, days to figure out, like, how do we thwart this? How do we spin up enough infrastructure to protect it? But the pieces were there. We just had to turn them on.
No, I mean, that's amazing that you can be able to like react so quickly and like make those changes on the fly like that, and then just immediately see a result of like, oh yeah, no, we see the next wave coming and suddenly we're not affected anymore.
Yeah, no, it was fun. It was cool. I mean, as much as it's not fun getting attacked, that was fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think with time we can realize like it's more fun. I'm sure in the moment it's like, no, we got to get this problem solved and we got to get it solved fast.
Yeah.
So I think the final thing I want to touch on is like sort of switching gears a little bit, as succinctly as I think we can try to do it with the time that we have remaining. Is I'm curious, like, how things have changed for you over time as you've gone like through the years of like as an IC engineer, moving more into like architecture, and like now as a CTO, like how is like that evolution sort of changed for you in terms of like how you like approach engineering problems and like tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a good call. Like, I mean, I think as an IC, you're sort of in learning mode, right? Like everything you're doing is your first time maybe, and your goal is to absorb from everybody around you, right? Like there's no illusion that you yourself are going to build everything. You're just going to kind of learn from the people around you. And I think as I've grown, that's what I've done, right? Like both learn how do you grow an organization and how do you grow an infrastructure and what kind of things, what is important when in a life cycle. Like when I joined Twilio, there were 20 people. And when I left in 2022, there were 8,500, right? And so there was that arc was how does the org grow over time, but it is also like what decisions do you make as you're building the infrastructure. And I think those are the pieces you learn, right? Like how do I build an organization? What kind of engineers, what skill sets should they have early on? What do you want to tell them to optimize for, right? Like when you're building a product like Twilio or even Ngrok, the reliability at scale is very, very important, right? Like I remember engineers coming to me and saying, I want to build this in Ruby. It'll be much faster for me to execute on it. And I had to tell them at Twilio, like, you can't build in Ruby because this has to scale for hundreds of thousands of phone calls. We build in Java or C, Go, so that our customers can write in Ruby, right? Like, and so there was that part of a learning of like, but that's not always true, right? There are some things that's better to just build quickly in a scripting language because you don't yet know if it's a good idea. You don't yet know if it's going to work. And so Ngrok has been interesting because for me, it's a little bit of a chance to step back into technology and into things with the foresight of like, what will happen 5 years out and 7 years out? What would it look like if our traffic quadrupled or we land a single customer that's bigger than all our customers, right? And I think those are the learnings that allow you to make some decisions that you can revisit. You'll hear people use the word two-way doors, right? And if it's a thing you can kind of back your way out of in a reasonable amount of time, then don't wait and think about it a bunch. Just do it.
Just go. Yeah.
And if it's a thing that like, okay, this is going to be a really expensive decision if I'm wrong later, those are the ones you sit and haggle about. Because as an engineer, especially building a company, time is the only enemy, right? Like you want to move quickly. You want to try things out. You want customers to they love that, right? Like that sense of, and I see this at Ngrok and I saw it at Twilio. Jeff Lawson, who was the CEO, used to joke. He's like, I want to be the train that's a mile ahead and pulling away. And that is very much true of a startup, right? You want to be building features and capabilities and listening to your customers, iterating quickly. And so as a CTO, my job is to keep priorities front and center to the engineers and let them know this is a thing you can do fast. And this is a thing you got to think about. But that part is fun.
Yeah. I think like one thing, and, tell me if this like sounds true to you, is like as time goes on, you start as an IC, you're focused on like, the engineering problems of like, like what code should I write? What language should I use? And then like, as you start like going further and further in the architecture, it's like, oh, well, what services and like how, like what should the architecture of this be? But I feel like there's this moment where you start realizing like the biggest problem to solve in this equation is like the human element. And like, you have to start like figuring out how do I actually like structure teams so that they work together better and organize them in ways that like they can focus on like the most important problems. Because I feel like sometimes, people can get like really hung up on like, oh, but like if I write it in this way, I can like make it work in so many other ways. And I think you touched on it like right there of like saying like, well, we can't write code in Ruby because as we go through the abstractions, like it's going to be too slow when, we have a customer down over there writing stuff in Go. And so like we need to be in the fast, like reliable, like low level type thing because somebody else is going to abstract on top of it. And like, that requires like that human element of like sort of helping people to understand like there's a bigger picture and there's layers to this whole thing. And like, how do I organize people to make them come together in the right way?
I mean, you're very much right? Like people love to think of software as like this technical endeavor that you can use AI and build your way out of, that humans will no longer at some point be necessary. And the reality is these systems are still very much human systems, right? Like, and so you have both the learnings of the people you hire, like which experiences did they have that you didn't in technologies or solving related problems? How do they interact with each other, right? Like who is listening, who's interacting, and what gets them excited, right? Like an engineer is going to do a good job if they're excited about the problem they're solving, right? Like they like the space they're working in. They feel like they're doing something that they themselves would have used or leveraged. So it's fun to work on developer tools because your customer is probably your friend or even you, which is ironic. And then the second motivation is, do I feel like I have freedom to kind of solve within some confine? As an engineer myself, there's an instant like ability for me to look at something and say, I know how you should write that. But I know as a leader, I can't do that, right? Because that's disempowering to engineers, right? And so they need to be able to be given the context of what the problem they're trying to solve, maybe a suggestion of where I've seen walls historically myself, but then the freedom for them to think and solve the problem in their own way. And that's what builds really powerful teams. As leaders, as ironic as it sounds, your job is to make yourself obsolete and unnecessary, right? And that's where it has to be, right? Allowing smart people to run and grow allows me to step out of half of those problems, right?
Yeah. I think what you said resonates It just resonates so much with me because I had an engineering manager that I worked with previously, and like I had discovered sort of like this architectural problem that I realized like it was like we were seeing reflections of it in different issues that were arising, and like I finally was able to go like, no, like this is the root cause of why we're having this problem. And it was like, this inherent design problem. Like we're just actually designing these models in the wrong way. And I figured it all out. I wrote it all up, and I even like had several proposed solutions. And one of the things that he said to me, which is what you just said right now, is that even though I figured out the whole problem, I'm not going to like win people over or get anybody wanting to work on it if I tell them the solution that they need to go implement. I just need to present the problem as well as possible so that a team gets to like go and like grasp the problem, see things that I didn't see. But the joy as an engineer is coming up with the solution.
It is.
And like that's how you empower and like allow people to grow. Is that you might see like, hey, there's this huge problem over here. I'm not going to solve it, but I am going to like figure out what the problem is and put the right people on it, and then they're going to go figure out how to solve it. And like that was like a huge unlock to me of like it's not enough to just be right. It's not enough to just like find like, oh, like there's this thing wrong. Like you have to figure out like, how am I going to rally people together to like believe that we should address this problem and like get them to like want to solve the problem and show like why it's going to be valuable. Like those are all like the human part of engineering it's a form of problem solving, but it's not with code.
Yeah. This is the hardest part about going through the engineering ranks. Like you missed the days where you were coding the solution. You have to be okay with that. You have to get your satisfaction from some other place, because it's not going to be you writing all the code and solving all the problems yourself. Like that is not how you grow, unfortunately.
Well, and I've actually like I've heard, I don't remember where I came across this, but it was an interesting take on like why the problems that you solve actually never get easier, because like as you get better and better at solving these problems, it's only the most difficult problems. Like as you've grown as like a leader, like you go like further up and you're zooming further out, and like the problems that eventually make their way to you always feel like the hardest problem. And it's like, well, for good reason, like because you've built these teams that are going to solve the easier problems, so like only the hardest problems are coming up to you.
That's
and
right.
Those are the ones that you're having to solve.
No, you're exactly right. It's funny but true.
Yeah, it's like one of those things where like it kind of hurts because you go, it's never going to get easier. It's actually supposed to just continually
That's right.
be just as hard or harder as it goes on.
Yeah, somebody told me as a CEO, you only get presented the hardest problems at the company. You have to be okay with that.
So I see that we're pretty much up on time here. I want to thank you again, Peter, for coming here, teaching us a little bit about Ngrok. I'm super, super excited to go and try out the TypeScript SDK. And my dream is to actually put this into like a CLI that somebody can use and like immediately spin up, test their webhooks with Square. If people are interested in learning more about Ngrok, what is the best way for them to actually go and check it out and try it?
Certainly, ngrok.com is easy. You will find our docs. You can just search for Ngrok SDK if you want. Pick the library or language you want. They're available on GitHub. So our GitHub repo under Ngrok also has all of this code. These are open source, so you can grab them and look at them if you want, but pull them down and play with them and give us feedback, right? Like they've been out there, they're heavily used by a bunch of folks, but it doesn't mean there aren't places to improve and make them better. So definitely reach out, let us know. And we have support at ngrok.com if you run into challenges and you need help. And I might even be manning that support some of those days. So you can talk to me.
Excellent. Well, you might be hearing from me. If you've got a project with Square, we'd love to hear about it. Reach out on Discord or X at SquareDev. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out developer.squareup.com for more. Keep building, and we'll catch you next time.